Here's Chapter 16 of the Ballad of Lucy Whipple. Chapter 16, Spring, Summer, 1852, in which an ill wind blows nobody good. Ever after I thought of it as the ice time, that February and March of 1852, when the snow would not melt and everything green froze, and everything frozen was too hard and too treacherous to lift, pick, or walk on. Tents collapsed from the weight of the snow, and those miners who stayed behind for the winter crowded into the boarding-house and the saloons. Anything or anybody outdoors overnight was an icicle come morning. Mr. Scadder let Bernard sleep on the floor of the general store in exchange for sweeping and stacking, packing and unpacking, and Brother Clyde's mule, Apostle, moved into the shed Bernard had inherited from Sweetheart. Food mostly ran out at the end of February, winter usually meaning lean pickings anyway, and we tried to stay alive on potatoes, barley broth, and a kind of bread made from flour and water, with a drop of molasses to kill the taste of weevils. Even Mr. Scatter's celebration pickled beets got eaten, and Jimmy said that now he would give $20 in gold for one of those fondly remembered sheet-iron steaks. I was afraid we'd be reduced to eating Tadlow candles. Rusty and the gent went hunting several times, but mostly came back empty-handed. One time Rusty returned without the gent, and we all feared he was lost in the snow. Many hours later, here came the gent, dragging the carcass of a deer. He figured he had pulled that deer near 6 miles through the snow. While Rusty and Jimmy cut up the meat, Mama rubbed the gent's feet with snow, for they were frostbit. He soaked them in cold and then hot water, till his toes were dead white and painful for a long time after. But we did eat good for a while. Lucky Diggins stayed indoors, animals sleeping and dreaming of green meadows, Mama and us sewing quilts and knitting stockings, and the miners entertaining themselves with poker, whist, ninepins, fighting for the last of the salted mackerel, drinking while there was drink, and listening for the arrival of a pack train. "I hear a mule bell!" someone would shout, and everyone within hearing would run to the door and look out, but see only snow falling, meaning the paths were not clear, and the passes were not open, and no butter or eggs or whiskey would be coming to Lucky Diggins today. Folks kept their spirits up any way they could. I had my books, which I turned into plays with Prairie, Sierra, and Jimmy, until no one would agree to watch any more. Mama and Brother Clyde talked heaven and hell, argued about sore foot remedies, and danced while the gent played his fiddle, saying we should pretend he was a whole orchestra and the cook stove a potted plant. One day, while I sat with a flapjack on my head trying to ease my headache, an old remedy of Grandma Whipple's, Brother Clyde bundled up Prairie and Sierra and all the clothes they could find and took them outside to count snowflakes. When they came in, noses cold and red, Clyde said, "We were almost finished counting when some snow blew in from the west and mixed with what we'd already counted." Prairie just snorted and wiped the steam from her spectacles, but Mama laughed and beamed on Clyde as if he were a hound and he her only pup. Although most of the folk in Lucky Diggins came from the old states, and we had suffered through long, harsh winters, we all grew winter-weary, this being California, not ordinarily so bitter. I could understand the passion of Prairie, who from time to time slipped outside to her garden, and scraped away the snow and ice to see and feel and smell the earth and crumble it between her fingers. A thaw came as it always does. The snow turned to mud, and the river to a mass of dark foamed waves. The sun even came out now and then to tease us with the promise of spring. One day I pulled on Butte's old India rubber boots and stepped outside. There was, for the first time since Christmas, no snow. The slush had melted, revealing the streets, for Lucky Diggins had grown to two, piled with gravel mounds, empty bottles, oyster cans, sardine boxes, worn-out kettles, and rusty tools. I looked up as a flock of ring-doves, happy to see the pale sunshine, swooped over the town, only to be met with pistol and rifle fire. Although I mourned for the soft dead birds, I did enjoy the stews and soups and pigeon pies we turned them into. By the end of April, Lucky Diggins was ready to start living again. The snow was a bad memory, the days warm and dry, the passes sure to open soon. Mama's crocus and daffodil bulbs set up soft green shoots, promising a riot of flowers if folks would just be patient. Brother Clyde left to go preachin', a jar of Mama's sorefoot remedies tucked in his sack, and a mess of new boarders moved in. May and June were like summer, hot and still. Grasses and wild berries threatened to overgrow the town, and flowers appeared in the middle of the streets and paths, in pits and holes abandoned by the miners, and even on the piles of mule manure thawing in the sunshine. The warm breezes were so welcome after the ice of winter. I ate most of my meals outside, face to the sun, trying to fatten up again. But as the hot days went on, I began to worry. If spring was like this, what would August bring? The warm breezes turned into hot wind, and there was no more eating outside. There was dirt in our food and our eyes and our mouths. My lips cracked and my hands as the hot wind sucked all the juices out of me. One morning that hot grin grew bolder, blowing like it came directly from hell, searing our faces and noses and throats. Twigs and dry leaves whipped through the air, several tents blew down, and the gent's top hat flew right off his head, down the street, across the river, and out of sight, while the gent stumbled swearing after it. He returned later bareheaded and bad-tempered. Prairie and Sierra were hot and fidgety, so I sat with them under a tree and tried to turn the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner into a story suitable for youngsters. "I don't want that story," said Sierra. "Tell me about Pa." "Well," I said, "Pa was the skinniest man I ever saw, with red hair and a big laugh." "Not that, Lucy. You always say that. Tell me something else about him. Were his ears big or small? Did he have freckles? All his teeth? Did you ever see him cry?" I dumped Sierra roughly off my lap and stood up to shake my skirts and get cool. "What did I say to Pete Lucy?" asked Sierra. Prairie looked up from her mending and said softly, "I don't think she remembers." "I do so remember," I said, marching the girls back into the house so Mama could deal with them for a while. Suddenly the sky grew darkish and the wind roared with a noise like thunder, blowing under the tents, through the cracks in the cabins, around windows and doors. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. Minutes later I heard the first cries. "Fire! Fire in the town!" Jimmy said later that it started in Billy Packer's restaurant when a lantern was blown over and ignited the canvas of the tent kitchen. From there it was blown by the wind to the blacksmith tent, then to the general store, the saloon, and the rest of the town. Tents and cabins and trees exploded into flame. The rows of wooden buildings on the streets caught fire quickly. Their skeletons stood for a while, glowing red before tumbling to the ground. The wind blew the fire through the west side of the ravine, so folks mostly scattered east across the river and up into the trees, carrying whatever we could to safety. Mama brought her coffee grinder and a picture of Pa, Milly her hat with flowers and a bottle of scent. Jimmy Whiskers had his tin plate with breakfast still on it, and Mr. Scatter his canary. I, of course, grabbed my pickle crock and the first book that came to hand. Prairie had a whistle Butte had whittled for her. Bernard could bring nothing but of his own, for he carried Sierra. The air was stifling hot, the sky dark with smoke, and the sun blood red. It was like the Ancient Mariner come to life. Covered with cinders and ashes, we stood under the shelter of the trees, watching the fire gobble up everything it touched, roaring louder than a train. It took 33 minutes by Mr. Scatter's pocket watch for that fire to burn down the town. It took a bit longer for it to reach the tents along the river and then clamber up the ravine into the woods, where it raced away from Lucky Diggins with a deafening roar. But it was many hours before we felt safe enough to come creeping back to see what was left, hoping in our heart of hearts things weren't as bad as we feared. They were. One wall of Mr. Scatter's saloon and an acre of ashes. That's what was left. Everything else was gone. The saloons, the general store, the smithy were gone. The boarding house and all my books but the one I carried were gone. The town was gone. We gathered together before the one remaining wall of the saloon. That place had been much more than just a thirst parlor to the folks of Lucky Dickens. It had served as a post office, gambling den, dance hall, livery stable, courtroom, church, assay office, social club, and extra bedroom on a number of occasions. Its charred wall was the only familiar thing in town, and stunned and overwhelmed, we huddled against it for comfort. There were Mr. Scatter and his canary, Mama and Prairie and Sierra and me, Bernard Freeman, Mrs. Flagg with Lizzie and Ruby Ramona, Milly from the saloon, Amos Frog, the blacksmith, Snooze McGrath, who did odd jobs, Poker John Lewis from the other saloon, Billy and Beppy Parker from the restaurant, King Luke, who ran the supply store, Ripley Gergens and his pants-wearing, pipe-smoking daughter Nessa, who were prospecting at Owl Creek, Jimmy Whiskers, the gent, a couple of other miners who had been caught in town when the fire started, and 3 scared mules. What were we to do now? "This town? It's done for," said Amos Frog. "It's finished," agreed the gent. "It's over. Gone. Through. Kaput." Defeat and hopelessness were so heavy I could almost smell them over the smell of burning and ashes and pines. I thought this might be a good time to talk about going home to Massachusetts, but one look at Mama's face shut my mouth fast. Lizzie was so distressed she let me hug her. Prairie just stood quiet, her hand in her mouth, while Mama tried to soothe Sierra, who was shaken all to pieces and kept crying about the monster, as if the fire were a roaring red dragon that had devoured Lucky Diggins. Mama kept looking up at the blazing hillsides and muttering about Brother Clyde wandering out there where the fire was. Me? I felt like all the air had gone out of me. Lucky Diggins wasn't much, but until I got back to Massachusetts, it was all the home and safety and certainty that I had. And now it was gone. Everything was gone. And we were stranded in the wilderness with nothing but a few trinkets and the clothes on our backs. I didn't cry, just sat dry-eyed and stared at the ashes, until I heard Billy Parker, his face red and dangerous, shout at Bernard, "We ain't had but bad luck since you came here, feller. Gold running out, bad weather, now fire. I think maybe you're a Jonah bringing hard times our way." King Luke and Poker John Lewis came up behind him, muttering and swearing, and I grew afraid. "Mama?" "Calm down, Miss Lucy," Bernard said. "Words don't hurt nobody none if they just stay words." Bernard started to walk away, but Billy stepped in front of him. Mama went right up to Billy and grabbed him by his red suspenders. "Don't we have enough trouble with the weather and the wind and the fire?" Mama asked. "Don't you have anything better to do than bait a youngster over things you know ain't his fault? Billy, it was your place where the fire started. I don't see anybody blaming you. Go with John and King and see what help you can be instead of trouble. Go! Shoot!" To my amazement, the men went. "That was brave, Mama," I said. Bernard nodded slightly in agreement and went off by himself. "Not hardly," said Mama. "Those ruffians don't have the guts of a rabbit when they're not liquored up." "Why did you call Bernard a youngster? Isn't he old?" "Hardly older than you, girl. You mean you never noticed that?" "Must be the beard makes him look old," I said, "or his sad face." I was a little ashamed that I had never really looked at Bernard as a person, but more like something I found up by the river creek, called by my father's name and brought home to play with. While the men of Lucky Diggins stood and argued about what to do next, we women set about gathering what branches and brush we could for shelter and beds. Whatever the men decided, we weren't going anywhere for a while. The fire had made the trail into Lucky Diggins a tangle of stubble, half-burned branches, and ash. No one was going to be passing over, under, or through that any time soon. "How old are you, Bernard?" I asked later, as we hunted nuts and seeds and spring greens that had escaped the fire to serve as a supper of sorts. "Don't really know, missy. I ain't 20 yet, I know that. Mr. Sawyer, he used to beat all the slaves when they got 20, so's they didn't get any ideas about being grown up and independent, and I never got that beatin'. You look older. Old, even. Mr. Sawyer, he's looking for a young runaway slave. Better I look old. Plenty of time to be young when I'm free. Bernard, I was thinking." I looked down and chewed on my lip. "I was thinking maybe it wasn't right of me to name you, like a doll or dog or something. You're a man, maybe you should choose your own name." "I agree, missy, I agree. And I'm choosing the name my friend offered, Bernard. I'm proud to have it." "Mr. Sawyer will never think to look for an old man named Bernard. I guess you're pretty safe here." "I hope you're right, Miss Lucy." I smiled. "Just Lucy." "I hope you're right, just Lucy." And Bernard smiled, finally smiled. He looked much younger. That evening was cool and eerie, with the smoke still rising from the ashes, with an awful stink, and the terrible quiet of a place without birds or squirrels or lizards, without crickets or bees or grasshoppers. A dead place. We mixed up all the edibles we had found into a sort of stew and tried to eat it. It tasted like ashes. Then just as it was getting dark, from all along the ravine, from down off those hills and mountains, spared from the fire, came rivers of light. The flickering, shimmering rivers all converged at a spot above the ravine, and flowed down toward the burned-out town. Everyone watched silently, curious and anxious. The river came closer and showed itself to be lanterns and torches of branches and tiny pine trees aflame, carried by hairy, dirty, bearded men in flannel shirts and torn pants, men loaded with blankets and tools and bedrolls, onions and coffee and beans. Miners from the hills who had seen the smoke and flames and had come to help, stumbling and tumbling through the pathless mountains, owning little but willing to share. They put down their bundles and stretched. A couple of the biggest took off their shirts and started chopping scorched trees into logs. Others shoveled ashes out of the way, while some made tents of twigs and branches and threw blankets over. We all stood around and watched for a minute. Jimmy said, "Seems gold's not the only thing of value in California," and started working right along with them. Finally, we all did. In the waning light I saw a movement near the river. "Ma!" I hollered. "Something is there." Amos Frog came over and called out, "Stranger comin'. Indian." I watched the stranger get closer and closer, coming out of the smoke and gloom, like some sorcerer or evil spirit. What trouble was coming now? Milly pushed Prairie and Sierra behind her. Poker John Lewis, his face all twisted and ugly, said, "Plug 'em," and some of the miners pulled their pistols. We waited. The Indian was wearing a leather apron. Smelling of bear grease and pine, he walked right up to the gent and began chanting, low and soft and mesmerizing. Suddenly he pulled from behind his back a high silk hat, wet and muddy and a little dented, but there it was, the gent's hat come back home. The gent clapped it on his head, pounded the Indian on the back, and laughed the only laugh heard around Lucky Diggins that day. By the light of treetops still on fire, I took the opportunity to see what book I had saved from the fire. It was the little Christian's book of pious thoughts. Then I cried. Mama, Prairie, Sierra, and I spent the night huddled close to one another and to the warmth of the embers of what we had lost. In the morning we poked through the smoking ashes to find what we could. In places those ashes were higher than my knees and too hot to touch. But Prairie managed to spy some spoons that had not melted into hunks of tin, a couple of pots, and Mama's cook stove, standing there just as good and proud as ever. Amos Frog found his tools, though the wooden handles were burned. Mrs. Flagg and Lizzie found some cracked and blackened jugs, and I unearthed the scorched metal frame of the Home Sweet Home sampler. There were some unbroken bottles in the saloon, and a barrel or two of salted meat in the ashes of the general store. Whenever someone found something good or whole or usable, we would call out, and everyone would cheer. Scorched bits of paper had settled like snowflakes on the ash heaps and burned stumps. All that was left of my books. A phrase or two here and there was readable. Friday. Yes, my nation eat mans. I now descended my rope ladder and joined my wife and children. You jest, Sir Knight. And my heart swells when I think of Torquilstone and the lists of Templestowe. I collected the scraps, and then not knowing what else to do, threw them to the winds. Mamma sifted carefully through the remains of the boarding house, looking for something of Butte's. "Seems like he's really gone now," she said to Prairie and me. "Not even a shoe or a shirt left to remind me of him." Mamma started to cry, so Prairie let her blow Butte's whistle, and then we all cried, thinking of Butte up in heaven watching his family standing in the ashes of their home, blowing a whistle to remember him. And that is the end of chapter 16.